Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second plenary of the International Conference on Sustainable Development for the session Nature Map, Mapping Nature and its Benefits to Jointly Address Biodiversity Loss and Climate Change. I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker and moderator, Dr. Guido Schmidt-Traub, the Executive Director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning to the US and good evening to Asia. Thank you very much, Lauren, for inviting us to present at this session. With my colleagues, we're pleased to present some work that we've done on addressing the loss of nature. I'm just starting up my slides now. Apologies, just one quick second. Here we go. We would like to just introduce Nature Map, which is a new decision support tool to integrate strategies covering biodiversity, carbon, water, and other land use services. This is work that has been led by a range of institutions, including IIASA in Vienna, the UNEP-WCMC, World Conservation Monitoring Center, the International Institute for Sustainability in Rio, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that many of you are familiar with. The basic challenges are well known. You see it every day in the news that we're losing biodiversity at unprecedented rates. Major reports have come out last year that show how important nature's contributions to people are to human well-being. The nature and the climate crisis are, of course, inextricably linked. Climate change is a major driver of nature loss, of biodiversity loss, and likewise protecting nature, in particular protecting tropical forests, makes a major contribution towards curbing climate change. We're not on track at all towards meeting the objectives. Just 2 weeks ago, the new Living Planet report showed that we've lost about 68% of mammals, of animals since 1970 worldwide. Many regions have experienced far higher losses than this. And so on current trends, we will not meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and we will certainly not meet the climate goals. So what to do? We decided to set up Nature Map to address two sets of related issues. At a very basic point, nature and biodiversity, of course, are spatial. Elephants and rhinos live in particular locations. Other forms of biodiversity are, of course, all very, very site specific. And what this means very simply is that you need maps. You need to use maps in order to understand, diagnose the challenges, identify areas for conservation, areas for restoration, and then plan or design around them. Yet if you look at national biodiversity and climate strategies under the conventions on climate and biodiversity, you'll see that they don't make use of maps at all. We have published a small working paper on this that basically shows that no climate strategies use maps in an operational sense. And that's, already tells you that we're not really operational, practical, and serious about addressing the interconnected issues of protecting nature and reducing the associated emissions. And then spatial data on biodiversity, carbon, and other nature services is fragmented and hard to access, particularly for governments. And so what we've done and what colleagues will describe here is we've developed a decision support tool that we're launching this week, which is available on the UN Biodiversity Lab website for anyone to use. The data is freely accessible. We're very grateful for the government of Norway's financial support for this work. One of the inspirations for this is there are a few countries that are using maps very proactively to diagnose the challenges, identify where there are areas of significant biodiversity, significant ecosystem services, and then design policies around them. Costa Rica is a famous example. Among the large countries, China stands out through its policy of what they call ecological conservation red lines, or eco red lines. You see here an illustration of the areas highlighted in red that are subject to an ecological conservation red line. That this accounts for about 25 to 28% of the country's territory. It's very, very significant, and not just in far-flung regions, but also around the major metropolitan areas like Beijing and Shanghai. Well, anyway, the basic point, what we're recommending is that biodiversity and be integrated into climate strategies. This, as already mentioned, has a number of really important benefits for climate because biodiversity accounts for large carbon stocks, the famous peatlands in Indonesia, many tropical countries, Brazil, but also the Congo basins, but also large peatlands in northern Canada, Siberia, the boreal forests. We need an integrated framework for nature-based solutions that target both climate and biodiversity objectives. And so obviously by looking at biodiversity and climate together, you can design better policies. And finally, nature and protecting nature, both by conservation and restoration, is critical for adaptation and resilience. Think of mangrove forests, which protect shorelines, but also store huge amounts of carbon. And the benefits for biodiversity and nature are also manifold. One is biodiversity loss is driven by many drivers, such as agriculture is the most important one, probably infrastructure, climate change, urbanization. All these drivers are outside the scope of the Biodiversity Convention. So integrating biodiversity into broader strategies helps you tackle the drivers, which is of course critical. Second, biodiversity is still struggling to get the same visibility as climate does. So putting it into the climate strategies will help raise visibility and hopefully get more political traction. There is, of course, quite a lot of financing, not enough, but quite a lot of financing for climate. We don't have similar mechanisms, and we don't have anything close to the scale in biodiversity. So connecting the two will also provide access to climate finance. And there are strong transparency accountability rules. And the UNFCCC has what's called a ratchet mechanism, a mechanism of periodic reviews where the ambition is increased. And so in closing, this is why we have launched the Nature Map initiative. And I'm pleased to hand over to my colleague, Burgess, the chief scientist of UNEP-WCMC, for an introduction into the technical work and a partnership behind the Nature Map initiative. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Guido. Hopefully I've got my camera working. Now I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see that. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of a tiny bit of the policy reasons why we've did this work, a little bit of the process to gather input and feedback from the scientific community, and a small amount about how we're making the information available for policy country use. And then I'm going to hand over to Piero Visconti, who's going to go through the more detailed parts of the technical work. So I'm giving more of the policy science interface part of the work. So Nature Map. Okay, it's not moving to the next slide. It is. Wonderful. So we're basically focusing here on the UNFCCC as Guido said, so the climate convention, but also a great deal on the CBD, the Convention for Biological Diversity, and especially on one of the three core objectives of that convention, basically the conservation of biodiversity. The other objectives are sustainable use and equitable sharing of benefits. So we're really focusing on the conservation side. And we're focusing really on one of the elements of the definition of biodiversity. So biodiversity includes ecosystems, diversity within species, between species, and ecosystems. Sorry, that's the full definition. So we're focusing mostly on the between species part of the definition. We're not looking at the genetic aspect so much, and we're not looking at the ecosystems part as much as other people do. So we're taking part of the definition of biodiversity from the CBD. And our broad aim is to support the development and implementation of the the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So as Guido says, we've all heard in last days that biodiversity is in deep decline. The CBD's own publication, GBO5 last week, showed that countries of the world failed to meet any of the 20 designated targets from 20 years ago. But there is, from 10 years ago, sorry, and there is a new program being defined for the next years up to 2030, but also up to 2050 under this GB Global Biodiversity Framework. The web link that's on this slide here actually takes you to a timeline that shows all the different meetings and processes that are underway to create that new global biodiversity framework. Of course, many of those being delayed through COVID-related issues, but the timeline is kept up to date if anyone wants to follow the timeline. Just to go over what we've done, so in NatureMap, we wanted to reach out to the scientific community. So we had a fairly large meeting in Cambridge in 2019 in a beautiful college called Clare College, where the sun shined and everyone got together and everyone could spend time talking to each other. And we gathered as much of the scientific kind of like overview about what should NatureMap do in that meeting, and that was a great meeting. Actually, one of the things which I think is telling of the current times is I couldn't find a picture of us actually talking to each other and being together, which is, I think, is a bit indicative of the world situation at the moment. So the document is there. It's a very good overview of the kinds of things that we knew in 2019, but without any pictures of humans actually interacting. In the second part of the consultation, reaching out to the scientific community, within the NatureMap process, we made quite a lot of beta level maps, test maps of distribution of biodiversity of one type or another, ecosystem intactness, different measures of biodiversity, and we put them out on this NatureMap Explorer website to gather input from the broader scientific community. And we got lots of feedback on these maps, and we use that feedback to make better versions, which are in the process of being finalized at the moment. The initial versions of many of the things are already actually available on a tool called the UN Biodiversity Lab, which is basically being developed to help countries primarily to understand what is the distribution of biodiversity and other nature attributes within their country, and to use that knowledge to help plan the conservation of biodiversity within their country borders, to help monitor the changes over time, to do a variety of national level kind of interventions linked to the CBD, the Climate Convention, SDGs, other kind of UN level processes. So that site already exists and has a lot of data on it. Somewhat excitingly, we're also making a new version of the UN Biodiversity Lab, so it'll be version 2.0. This is being done as a partnership between United Nations Environment Programme, United Nations Development Programme, National Geographic Society in the USA. There's input from Google, and there's input from a lot of other scientists around the world to make this new data platform. So it's very much collaborative work. The new platform and the associated data, including all the final versions of the NatureMap data, will be made available by January 2021 if everything goes to plan. So there will be a launch of that. There's a very much sneak peek launch of this in a couple of weeks, but it's just to show you the platform in brief. Full launch in January. Lots and lots of global data layers, the best that we can kind of find, representing different attributes of biodiversity and threat and pressure and ecosystem services and carbon and all of those kind of things. So it'll have those kind of data layers on it. It has some automated functions in it, so it does some automated calculations for you when against certain kind of questions that you can pose to it. So that's quite clever, and it has a very useful set of additional functions. So if you're a country, you can set up a password protected project within the tool, and you can have your own national data sets put against and alongside the global data sets, and can use those for various kinds of national level planning. So it's country sort of focused, but it could also be an institution that signs up and puts its own data in and does various kind of things within the platform. It's designed to be like that. And the final kind of attribute that we are working hard on is that the data layers that are in this tool have got some kind of UN level of approval, some sort of stamp of authority on it, that this is a good layer for representing this attribute of biodiversity. So we are working quite hard on criteria for how would you grade spatial data layers, and how would you give them some kind of starring or traffic light rating in terms of their quality and their availability and their spatial resolution and those kind of criteria. But so that's just a sneak peek of something that's coming up, and I will now hand over to Piero, who is going to take us on to the more detailed stuff about how did NatureMap make its data layers.
Thank you, Neil, for the great introduction. I'm gonna start sharing my screen now. You should be seeing my slides. So the first thing we did is look for the most authoritative, up-to-date, and new data on biodiversity that we could use to identify areas of importance for biodiversity, carbon, and water. And in doing so, we also looked at data that was ensuring that we don't miss out on areas that are important. And so to do so, we looked at what data has been used in the past for identifying global areas of importance for biodiversity, and typically this is restricted to mammals, birds, and reptiles from IUCN, which is the most authoritative data source on distribution of species. And we looked at complementing those with the taxonomic groups that don't share the same hotspots of richness and endemicity. And we looked at reptiles and plants because we had comprehensive data sets for reptiles from the University of Tel Aviv. And also they share different patterns of distribution. And also for the first time, we were able to get our hands on representative samples of plant species, about 40% of plant species, from data from IUCN, Botanic Garden Conservation International, and BN, Botanical Informatics Ecological Networks. So with this data in hand, we took the range maps, which we had, and refined those using both elevation and range from information from the literature and expert opinion, and habitat types. So for instance, you have this species here, the curassow, that lives in southeast Brazil. This is a rainforest specialist and only occurs in lowlands. So you start off with the IUCN range map, which is outlined in blue, and then while removing all areas that are not rainforest, you end up only with the pale blue. Sorry, with the black, and the elevation you remove all the pale blue. So you end up basically with only these small fragments of rainforest or lowland that are actually suitable habitat within the range of the species. So, and you start off with this blue outline. So what this does is removes the false presence rate, commission error, and make sure that you are identifying all the areas that are very likely to have the species in there. And we did it for all species that we had data for. But we realized in doing so that we needed better land use and land cover products. When we started, the best global land cover product was Copernicus from European Space Agency. And for instance, in Southeast Asia, you see that the Copernicus maps Borneo, Sumatra and Java and Sulawesi as broadleaf rainforest, except that we know that some of these areas are logged and covered on agroforestry and alpine plantation. So we use a tool called GeoWiki that IIASA developed, which is a citizen science platform that allows users to basically tag very fine scale aerial photos or satellite imagery. And we used very fine scale data for forest, both boreal, tropical, and temperate forest. And we asked expert users to basically identify whether these were woody plantation, replanted forest, palm plantation, agroforestry, and so on. And we did it with multiple tags, and we use these labeled data points against machine learning methods to come up with the first ever map of global forest management. And you can see that the final result is much more similar to what we know Southeast Asia looks like. And this avoids basically over prediction of suitable habitat for species and allows us to focus on areas that are indeed important for conservation as they stand. With this data in hand, the WCMC team was able to update their maps of biodiversity intactness as well as local relative abundance and local richness using the Predix modeling framework. And colleagues at King's College London and WCMC were able to update potential water provision and realized water provision using, again, information on land use and land cover, which we produced for the first time. Finally, the WCMC and the IIASA team were able to update both soil organic carbon and above ground biomass carbon, which we combined together in a map of total vulnerable carbon, as in carbon that would be lost if land use transitioned from the present state to anthropogenic use. With this data in hand, what we did is we used optimization techniques to ask the question: if we were to protect 10% of land globally, and we wanted to minimize extinction risk of species and maximize carbon and maximize clean water provision, what would be that 10%? And if we were to do 20%, what would that be? The reason why we use optimization techniques as opposed to overlaying this information is that each of these targets scale in different ways, especially biodiversity species targets, and therefore stacking up maps will not identify the most efficient solution. As in, there are emergent properties of sets which require recomputing the value of each site depending on what other sites have been selected. With these methods and data, we identified areas and we explored various weighting schemes across biodiversity, carbon, and water, as in solutions that were putting more emphasis on biodiversity than the other two natural assets, and solutions instead at the extreme that were putting more emphasis on either carbon or water and anything in between. So this map here is showing a solution of areas that were equally weighted for three assets. Areas in red are those that are selected in the top 10%, so the best 10% of the planet to achieve targets for all three assets. And when you move towards shades of orange and yellow, you start moving towards the best 50%. The tropics stand out especially for the biodiversity value. And interesting aspects of this new analysis compared to the past is that places that have been outside the conservation focus so far because of usage of only mammals, plants, and amphibians show up. For instance, Southeast US, which is quite important for freshwater turtles and alligators, and also part of the dry semi-deserts of Australia show up because of their importance for lizards and snakes. And also much of northern latitudes come up as important for the endemic plant species. And interestingly, you notice that the area around in northern Canada, northeastern Canada, Hudson Bay are in dark red because of their carbon content, especially soil carbon. And the area west of the Urals instead is particularly important for water provisioning, and then that's why it comes up there. As I said, we looked at different trade-off schemes, which are going to be a subject to the next slide, but we also looked at how benefits accumulate with increasing ambition. So moving from 10% of land protected to 70%, how much more species targets can you achieve, and whether the accumulation curves are more or less steep depending on whether you optimize for only one asset, so biodiversity only, or whether you try to strike a balance between biodiversity and other two natural resources. And you can see that you quickly can achieve most extinction prevention targets when you optimize for biodiversity only, and an area around 30% optimally placed could already improve the conservation status of all species that we looked at for about 80% of them. This gets a bit more complicated, but basically what it does is shows you the trade-off frontier across different optimizations. So each dot was a different scenario of spatial optimization across these three assets. And this boomerang-shaped curve represents each area budget. So this is the top 10% of the bottom left, then 20%, and so on. And each dot shows a different weighting schemes. For instance, on the left-hand side, you have weighting schemes that put more emphasis on water than carbon. And what they show is that there are indeed trade-offs, as in there are choices to be made, but there are also lots of synergies. There are places on Earth that are valuable for all three assets, and there is a sweet spot of weighting schemes here in the middle, where you basically increase the gain in one of the other assets without losing much of the other two. Some usage notes: these are global analysis that we applied to each individual asset and in combination, 2 by 2 and all three together. Global analysis means that we don't prescribe what actions to be taken in these places. Rather, we just say that in order to achieve targets for biodiversity, carbon, and water, if you like, to maximize synergies between the three conventions of Rio, these are the broad areas that we need to look at. But what we do is a subject of a national conservation planning analysis, which require, for instance, information of what specific actions are in disposal. It could be protected areas, but it could be also community managed forest, or it could be restocking of populations that are depleted there, or addressing poaching or other pressures to biodiversity. This needs to be done at national level or subnational level with the specific data. And this includes also accounting for cost and opportunity, governance options, and tenure. Yet this is valuable at the global scale to first give us a sense of the upper limit of the benefits that we can do, and also realize that there is so much synergies between actions for mitigating climate and addressing biodiversity that we need to explore. The next presentation is going to be a video recorded from Adrian Mongeau, that is going to be put on by the SDSN team, and this is work that explores national applications under our supervision and starts addressing some of the points that I just mentioned. Thank you.
Argentina is a producer and exporter of food, but to achieve sustainability, we need to take care of our natural capital. The conservation of biodiversity is not really a top priority on international or national agendas, so it is necessary to find global and local allies. At a global level, the nature-based mitigation of greenhouse emissions is one of the best allies of biodiversity conservation. So, it is essential to locate sites where the capture and retention of carbon in soil and biomass coincide with sites of high biodiversity. At the local level, people value the most obvious ecosystem services for the quality of everyday life, such as sources of clean water. For this reason, the best local ally to protect biodiversity is to find sites where the protection of pure water sources coincide with sites to protect biodiversity. Obviously, biodiversity is the complex machinery that nature has to carry out the processes of carbon capture and retention, and also the processes of water cycle. But that complexity is more difficult to be prioritized in the political narrative. For that reason, we need to dock all three goals at once. In some way, carbon and water are flagships of biodiversity as a local and global ally. We applied Nature Map in Argentina to locate the sites where the priorities of biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and protection of pure water sources coincide spatially. We organized an international team. The team from Argentina, together with the participation of the IIASA, SDSN, WCMC, FABLE, and the King's College of London. Then, we made a joint team between politicians and scientists. Personnel from the Ministry of Environment of Argentina worked with our team of scientists. We held workshops to establish joint goals for the medium and long term. We established a consensus on the roadmap to follow based on science and political feasibility. We made a selection of more than 400 specialists in different subjects, and we called them to put together the database. Several scientific societies in the country were summoned and consulted. And then, we put together the whole layers and ran a spatially explicit prioritization model. My colleague Pablo will explain the methods and results.
The first step to integrate all the information is to divide the country land into a large number of planning units. This allows us to define a georeference conservation status vector that indicates whether each planning unit is being managed for conservation or not. In the second step, the spatial information of area of habitat of species and the water and carbon stocks is condensed into a resource matrix. The product of the conservation vector and the resource matrix allows us to quantify the amount of each asset that is being conserved by each solution. Dividing these quantities by the conservation targets already defined by the experts, we obtain our main figure of merit, the one we want to maximize, the relative target fulfillment for each feature under consideration. To find the conservation status vector that achieves this maximum, we set a constraint optimization problem that is solved numerically. Additional relevant parameters for this problem are the weight distribution across assets and the amount of land that will be managed for conservation. This approach, based on spatial optimization, enables rapid identification of high priority areas for conservation. Many different criteria may be applied. For instance, if we seek to maximize the fulfillment of biodiversity targets alone, we obtain a significant progress, up to 90%, dedicating only 30% of the country land. The same exercise may be repeated for water, carbon in biomass, carbon in soil separately. Of course, the optimal allocation of each asset produces different maps. Improved scenarios are obtained optimizing across assets. Prioritizing only biodiversity and clean water provisioning, for instance, we find a drastic increase in water conservation at the expense of a small reduction in the fulfillment of biodiversity targets. This combined optimization may be applied for any pairs of assets, but also for the full set. We perform an exhaustive scan of this four-dimensional space and plot the minimum versus the average target fulfillment obtained for each map. This means that points more to the right correspond to more efficient solution in general terms, while the vertical position indicates how balanced each solution is. Based on these two criteria, we identify for each amount of land dedicated to conservation a set of 10 best solutions and use them to build maps showing the top priority areas in each case. Above each map, the bars show the target fulfillment of each asset. Combining all these solutions, a single priority rank map, as the one shown at the right, can be produced. This spatial explicit approach can be used to analyze the interaction of conservation targets with other land uses as well. In this first example, we studied the trade-off between conservation priorities and the capacity to produce food. By computing this overlap, we were able not only to find the solutions that least affect food production zones, but also to identify the regions of highest conflict and reallocate them to achieve viable solutions.
Our philosophy is so simple that it can be synthesized with a single symbol: and. Science and policy, people and nature, climate and biodiversity and ecosystem services, food production and sustainability, all rather than or, and, plus, plus, plus.
Thanks so much, everyone. Our speaker, Dr. Guido Schmidt-Traub, seems to have a few issues with his microphone. So if Piero or Neil could come in and just moderate the questions would be great. Thanks so much.
Sure. There is one that just came up, which I can answer. I agree entirely with Lynn Schlettmo about overlaying. Indeed, that's why we choose not to do overlay analysis. We specifically ask questions of, if you have multiple objectives at once and you want to achieve them both, what do you do? At the global level, it is sufficient to look at broad areas that are important for multiple objectives. But at the national level, for instance, in Argentina, it's important to start planning for multiple socioeconomic as well as the environmental objectives. And indeed, that's what Adrian's team did with agriculture. So they were asking the questions, okay, you want to still produce enough food, but you also want to achieve targets for nature. What do you do? This is not overlay, and I guess the planning is just as important, if not important, more important than the maps themselves. And these decision support tools allow people to explore alternative planning solutions that satisfy multiple, sometimes competing agenda.
Are there any other questions out there from anybody? There's the Q&A kind of tab on the chat line. There's one question in there which I think Piero has answered. Okay. How to best communicate. Sure. I mean, I'll answer that a bit. I mean, our intention through using this UN level link up, so linking up with UNDP and UNEP and other kind of UN agencies would be that if the data is inside a widely available, freely available tool that's being kind of promoted by the UN for country level use, then that should get to various parts of government where they are undertaking these kind of planning exercises, and so it's a contribution to that process. I think also the academic kind of like publications and that kind of route that we'll be pursuing will get it into the knowledge base of all the academics around the place. But I think one of our key targets is the planning agencies and climate agencies and nature agencies within countries. I can see there's lots more questions now. Piero, do you want to take a next one?
I know it's not the most upvoted, but I think it's important, the one about mountain regions. So mountain regions pop up for two reasons. First, because of diversity gradients. There is typically more diversity of species in those areas because there is more environmental gradients of different climate and different habitat types. So that's why they show up. And also often there is lots of narrow ranging species there. So species with small ranges, and which means that those places are more irreplaceable than others to protect those species. The other reasons for why mountain regions show up is because often is only places where things are left. Lowland, same or similar habitats in lowland have been already degraded or lost, and therefore species and ecosystems hang in then in these more steep and less accessible and fertile places. Then there is the environmental activist. I think we're working more with large-scale international NGOs, and perhaps Neil can complement on that in terms of disseminating our work and allowing them to make informed decisions about large-scale initiative, for instance, whether they are fundraising for a region in particular, or supporting more regional offices. I think this is the scale at which this kind of outputs are useful. Then, of course, at the national and subnational level, just like the Bariloche Foundation in Argentina, they are obviously key stakeholders for national implementation.
And just to add a little bit more on, yes, I mean, for sure, the large conservation NGOs use these kinds of data, and we think that the biodiversity layers and other layers that we've made here are, better than the ones that currently exist. So we assume and we believe that, WWFs and all the kind of organizations like that will use these layers, especially because they'll be freely available on a place where you'll be able to download them. So they will be used by those kinds of organizations. There's some questions in the chat about how it can be used by sort of more local advocacy type organizations, I think. So they obviously provide a very good idea about what is important, which places are important. The bit that's not quite here in what we've done and may come, in a next phase of work is to link the biodiversity data and the land cover data with the fact that remote sensing now allows things to change, regularly. So there's annual updates of many of the land cover data sets now, and increasingly fine scale. And if you have an annual change measure in there, you'll be able to say that piece of forest or other habitat which has high biodiversity value or high carbon value seems to have disappeared or been degraded in the last year. And okay, a year is still quite a long time, but it will, I think, give more locally based advocacy type organizations some way to look at what's happening in the area. And indeed, protected area authorities and others would be able to use this kind of information. The Global Forest Watch tool, World Resources Institute, kind of already does that, but it doesn't do it for biodiversity. So I think we're hopeful that we can have a second phase of Nature Map where we'll do more national level work with selected countries, but also that we can start to make these products into a temporal, annually updated product. And that's one of the ideas of the UN Biodiversity Lab 2, that it would have 10-meter resolution land use, land cover data that's updated annually. and then we could see how things are changing at very fine scale all the way across the terrestrial part of the world. We must admit we don't do marine here, I think, so I'm going to be honest and say we're really only looking at the land in what we're doing so far. But Guido has appeared. Hello, Guido.
Yes, hi. Just to add a couple of points. Thank you for these great questions. Just on the marine side, we are coordinating with partners, National Geographic. They're basically doing similar mapping for oceans, and one of the projects that we have is to integrate those maps. There's one big question on how to drive policy impact at the country level, as Neil has already said, is what we've done now is we've put forward a global map that was important to integrate the data and to really collect the best available science on this. This is something that every country can use now. There's one question how universities can contribute to this, and basically where we want to get to is that anyone with the required programming skills and knowledge of conservation science can apply this data to their countries and to, of course, complement it. The example of Argentina shows that they've used nature map techniques, but they've complemented it with local data and replaced it with local data where appropriate. This is something that should be happening in every single country. And this goes back to the first question with the largest number of votes here, is what we believe is that putting out these maps and making them official, making them part of the policy discussions is a necessary step for getting everyone to think more clearly about what it means to protect biodiversity, what are the needs and what are the opportunities. There's some problems that need to be addressed. In many countries, you've got conflicting land uses, you've got illegal concessions, the rights of indigenous people are not protected. So those problems come out very clearly once you put maps on the table, and they need to be resolved. There's no other way of doing this. If you don't resolve these problems, nature will disappear. But then, as our work shows, there are also many synergies, there are many positive benefits that come out of this. Once you put the maps out, you can actually see that some areas are particularly valuable for a nature, a carbon, and, for example, a water perspective. So those then rise up in priority, and what we've seen in discussions is that putting these maps on the table just allows everyone to see more clearly. So we see this basically as a method for problem solving. That problem solving needs to be driven by local partners. And at the SDSN, we of course believe that universities have a vital role to play in all of this, and we'd love to work with SDSN networks, other partners, to enable these kinds of discussions at the country level. And the Nature Map Consortium will be there to support you as best as we can.
I can take also the other questions. So the one about university campuses, I think there is something else a university can help with, which is supporting the production and uptake of raw biodiversity data. We run an iNaturalist campaign. It's a citizen science app where people can take photographs of wildlife, and everyone needs experts identifying these pictures. I'm gonna put on the chat the link to our citizen science campaign on plant species, and universities can help there by posting new photos, but especially identifying the pictures of plants that have not been identified so far. This can help us filling up the Wallacean shortfall, as in our gap in knowledge or where biodiversity is at the very fine scale. There is also a question of from Liz Sideropoulos about false optimism in green cover. I don't think we showed any map that was showing the increase in green cover over time, but I'm happy to follow up offline on this. But indeed, I agree that even if there was an increase in green cover, that would not equate more biodiversity. And I think using species distribution data or a measure of intactness, it's helpful there, because having more green space doesn't equate more intactness, and that's why there is value in using the predicts framework and the aero habitat mapping for that. I think that's as far as I can go with my technical.
I'll just come in once more on the question of greenness. Yeah, we're extremely aware that, you know, plantations of just one species of tree can appear green on satellite remote sensing, and those kinds of plantations typically have very low biodiversity values and also quite low carbon often as well. So we're very much aware of that, and as Piero says, we seek with these kinds of models to make those areas look, well, not make them, I mean, they should look from the models not good for biodiversity because they don't have the species of interest in them. So yeah, we try to avoid that problem for sure. Guido, I think we're asked to wrap up in a couple of minutes, so I don't know if there's any final observations.
Maybe just, just basically a call to action to all of us. There was a question about Pakistan, how does NatureMap help here? And I think many of you, we have people from all over the world on this meeting. You'll be asking the same questions. What we would like to do is to figure this out, how this kind of tool can be applied. Obviously, our team is unable, it's a small team, is unable to work in every single country. What we collectively need to figure out how this kind of data can be made available and become policy relevant in every place, in every location. This is a question of massive scaling up. The technology exists now to make this happen. At the SDSN, we're investing heavily in online training. So we want to do online trainings on how to do NatureMap in any country, because of course, the success will require that you can do this in Pakistan or any other country without Piero or Neil having to travel or having to devote a huge amount of time on it, because there's only 2 of them or 1 each in the world. We can't clone them. And we just don't have enough experts of that caliber to work in every single country. That's what we at the SDSN would like to work with you on. We'll discuss it with colleagues in the SDSN to see how the various networks can help with this work. And in the meantime, what I do want to just emphasize once again, we didn't place so much focus on it, is next year is a big year. The year 2021 will see landmark conferences of the climate and the biodiversity conventions. That is an opportunity to put these issues center stage. Every country is sending delegations to these meetings. Every delegation will be asked and is asking itself, what can we offer? What can we present? What is our strategy? And that's an opportunity for us to really remind everyone of the vital importance of maps. It's a simple call. Everyone understands it. Nobody will dispute the need for such maps. And once you start the process of getting into the nuts and bolts of preparing the maps, you uncover many of the challenges. And as I've said, it becomes a great method for problem solving. So that's what it is. If you are in touch with the SDSN, if this is how you found out about this event, please expect to hear from us soon. Reach out to our colleagues. There are national networks in many of these countries. And we very much look forward to continue this excellent conversation. If there's nothing else, then I would just like to thank everyone on behalf of the 3 panelists. A huge thanks to the organizers of the session. A big thanks to Micheline, who's made everything possible in a very short amount of time. This is just a curtain raiser of the initial conversations. We're making the presentation and the video publicly available. We'll find a way to get this information to you as part of the ICSD documentation, so please check the website. There's going to be another public launch event. You've also seen that information in the chat. We'll share that once again with you. Please spread the word and reach out to us. You can reach us at info@naturemap.earth. Very simple, info@naturemap.earth. I'll also put it in the chat, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all very much, and have a great continuation of this wonderful event.
Thank you very much.